Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be here back again. Yeah, there's been quite a few. I've just missed a couple, I think, over the years because of the weather. So once again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the small grain varieties testing here in northeastern North Dakota and also across the other eastern part of the state. We do have our annual report. We have it over there on the table. Plus, there's the extension guide that lists the variety descriptions and all the varieties from the different research centers. So there's a lot of information out there. If you get Prairie Green News, you get that magazine, you can see results from Minnesota and South Dakota. So there's lots of different options. And this year we tested about 55 different varieties at the research centers across the state. So there's so many of them, it gets confusing even to me. So basically, I'm going to show a lot of numbers sometimes and stuff, but mostly going to hit the highs and lows or point out some things that's just too much to absorb. And it'll hopefully be on a website. I think they're putting a lot of the talks on today on a YouTube channel or something, so you'll be able to go back to it later. I always like to start out just kind of, hey, what was grown this past year? And soybeans were down, and spring wheat was down, for acreage. Corn was down. And durum was down, and barley I have on here this year, now it's up a little bit. So if everything's down, what happened? Well, across the state, we had about 2.8 million acres of prevented plants. So the way the spring was, we couldn't get all the acres in that we wanted to. And I kind of like to go back to, how the season one was. Of course, 2021 was excessively dry, but we did get some moisture in the fall. I was looking on the Langdon maps, and across these kind of the northeast part of the area, range from 120, about 190% in normal. So we did catch up a little bit in the fall. And of course, the spring, that's pretty fresh in our memories yet. From beginning of April to the end of May, we had moisture levels that were 200% above normal. But starting the first part of June till about the end of August, our precipitation levels across this region were anywhere from 60 to 80%, mostly, with a few areas up in Pembina County and part of Cavalier County were a little bit above normal. But we did have, of course, with all that previous moisture, we did have enough to carry the crop through, and we had generally a good season. This just looking at growing degree days, normal growing degree days, you get about 22 degree days. So we had about, maybe 3 to 4 on the wheat end of it, 3 to 4 days where we had a little more heat units than the average. If you would look at the temperatures on and on, hopefully if you can see that, but it's about 0 to about 0 to 1 degrees higher than it would be if you had it. Well, I'll just talk about this slide and you'll see it a little bit. I got this one from Andrew Green. Can hardly see it myself, but on the left side it says what a producer wants. Well, a producer wants grain yield, obviously. It's probably your number one priority. Then we have straw strength you're interested in, and you like shorter plant height. And basically, you want good harvestability of that crop. Well, the end user likes to have flour extraction, good dough strength, flour absorption, low volume. And in the middle there, what both the producer wants and the end user wants is grain protein, test weight, falling numbers, and disease resistance. So you guys are buffet, you talk about yield most of the time. You certainly don't talk about low volume. But so this is the kind of conundrum that the plant breeder is to provide the what people want in it, what the farmers want, what the producers want. Oh, there we go. It's like magic. Feel better now. Yeah. These are the varieties that were raised statewide. The highest one statewide were Valda, and we had Igmar, Murdoch, and W9590. And then the northeast part of the state, and that's really includes 7 counties. So sitting here in Devil's Lake, we're pretty close to the north central and the one below us. So, but basically the top ones were Murdoch, Valda, W9590, and then the Faller, and then lesser amounts of the other lines. So the state varieties represent 53% of the acreage. And so there's a lot of other varieties that are grown in small amounts across the state. Newer varieties released this past year. South Dakota State is one called Ascend, Champions Alliance Group, Recoil, and 2 for Lima Grain, Ascent, and Hamer AX. AX is the action system. So you have some grasses or feral rye in there. That's essentially a sure that you're spraying on it to get it out. Ross is a new one from Minnesota, MS Charger from Radiant Seed, and ND Huron from NDSU. And some of these lines we talk about, you know, they're just first year out. So if you're interested in those lines, there may not be a lot of seed availability this year. So just a quick rundown of who's got what here. The newer one from NDSU is ND Huron. And that's essentially a line that's more adapted according to Dr. Green, the breeder. Really, best adaptation is west of Highway 83. So the mine out on down south, west of there would be the best place to grow that particular line. Newer lines from Minnesota is Torquay. Had some quite a bit increase in acreage this past year. And their newest one is called MN Rosse. That's kind of a linker type with not the high fields, but it's got good protein. And again, it has very strong straw. Syngenta AgroPro has a lot of lines that are being grown. Newer ones are AP Smith, kind of average yield and average protein, kind of a balanced type line. Gunsmoke CL2, and also the SYCL. Of course, those are lines that you can also spray beyond. Of course, but there's a lot of resistance to some of these herbicides as well, so you have to keep that in mind as well. Newer ones from South Dakota, EC Ascend. That line looked pretty good in the eastern part of the state here this year. It's a little bit taller than some of the other varieties. Lima Grain lines, I guess we mentioned already, the Hamer and the Accent. Ones, Busters look pretty good over the years, and Trigger is probably the line that has a highest yield we've had in the region, but has also the lowest protein. Cropland lines, several of those lines, I guess I'll mention the ones with the A at the end, those are on this line. And these varieties, especially the 3099 has looked pretty good in our trials this year. And of course they're on this, and these varieties are probably some of the later maturing lines that we have. West Red, the most popular ones are 9590 and 9719. And Chargers, the newer one that we talked about, that also looked pretty good this year. 21st Century Genetics, these 3 we looked at for the past few years. And Dynagro one's the Ambush, probably most popular in the area. Allegiance from CHS, these generally aren't in the state trials, but they come to individual research centers. So we had 3 lines from those, the numbered lines here. And then Champions Alliance Group, there's 3 newer lines from them. Again, don't know really where they're getting these lines or the background breeding companies they're getting them from, but they're new to the market. And also the Crop Improvement Association got some lines out of Canada that they're looking at. Some of these AAC Brandon, Starbuck, Wheatland, and Rush. Generally lines from Canada are not as high yielding, but they have good protein and good quality. Scab, just gonna talk about the highest and the best here. The ones that we had with the lower scab reactions, and these are over statewide basis with scab trials and other various sources. Gunsmoke, Justify, Trigger, the newer one, Torgy and Huron. And then we get to the ones all the 4s and 5s, which is kind of the middle of the road. I didn't list all of those, but the ones had a little more susceptibility were the Murdoch and the ones from 21st Century Genetics and the Westbred 9590 and Longmire had the most susceptibility. It's always good to remember the scab when you spray it. Generally, when you spray fungicides, you get anywhere from 8 to 12% increase in yield, but with the Dawn, you only get about a 60% reduction in the actual Dawn number. So if you start out with a more susceptible line, you probably, and have a lot of scab, you're still going to have a slightly higher amount of scab than if you had a line that was more resistant. Bacterial leaf streak has been an on and off problem the last few years. And generally, of course, it's a bacterial, so fungicide doesn't control it. The lines with the most resistance, Recoil, Buster, Trigger, and Torgy. Most of the varieties were 5 and 6, and then there's a number of them that have susceptibility. The Charger and the Huron, some of the newer ones, and the ones that have the most susceptibility. A lot of these aren't grown around here except probably the 9590. So these are just data that was collected on lines from the eastern part of the state, and these are at the research centers, generally, or at the Grand Forks site. So Langdon, Carrington, Castleton, Grand Forks, Prosper, we have 5 different locations there. So these are just the top lines. Trials were very good this year. Of course, 2021, we had a lot of issues everywhere, the drought, not only for your producers, but for some of the variety trials as well. But trial results this year were good across all locations. So the highest yielding varieties we had were the Trigger, yes, newer one Ascent from South Dakota, and the newer one Charger, and then Spitfire. The ones in the lighter color here, those are varieties that had a more significant amount of the acreage. So done their newer lines, Torgy, Recoil, some of this Hammer, and then Ascent, all were towards the top of the yield. At Langdon, we do have off-station sites, 4 off-station sites, and you combine that with Langdon, you typically have about 30 lines in the trial. Generally, how we pick them is if they have over 3% of the acreage across the northeast part of the state, we'll include it. We'll have the company submit a couple lines, and if they want more than that, we usually charge a fee for them. So this year, we ended up with about 30 lines, and across the locations this year, our top variety was the Charger and the Trigger. The one on this one, 3099, Volda, Spitfire, Ambush, Faller, and Murdoch. And if you go down the line, the AP Smith, I talked about from Minnesota, a newer one. It's kind of a balanced one. The AC Ascent was a little bit above average. And, as our average line there, I guess the ones that had the lowest yield here, the Huron, Cobra, Heartland. And as you see in the next slide, some of these with the lowest yields are the ones that have the higher proteins. You can see the Heartland Huron, which had some of the highest proteins this year. Torgy also had pretty good yield. It also had good protein as well. And the newer one, Ross, they had about average protein as well as the AP Smith. Some of the lower ones, again, were our higher yielding ones with protein, Trigger, Charger, the 2 on-list types from Cropland, and Ascent from Lima grain would also been a little bit lower. So if you look at those locations, the varieties had yields above average and also had protein above average. Would have been Ambush, Cropland 3530, Gunsmoke, Wildcat, and Smith. Then they also had protein levels that were above average. These are just some comparisons, some selected varieties across the 5 eastern locations that we talked about prior. So some of the ones I picked out, the 8 Ascend and the Charger were the top yielders, so I left them in there, and Murdoch. So all these varieties, here's the yield line for average and the protein. So a number of these lines here all had above average yields. The ones that had higher proteins with above average yields across the eastern part of the state included the Reckless, and the Justify, the 9590 and the Rebel. Buster had higher yields, but did have a little bit lower protein. And then when you look at these lines here, I glued these in just as a higher yielding varieties, but everything over here, lower yielding varieties, but we had the higher proteins, and a lot of those with the lines out of Canada, Brandon, Starbuck, Wheatland, and some of the ones that have good protein, Bulls and Glen, and Bulls typically has the highest protein levels that we would grow. And just one more variety slide from Langdon. Some lines like lines from CHS were only tested at Langdon. 822 had the highest yield, the lowest protein, where the 8432 had lower yields, but the higher protein. And just kind of the checks that comparing it against, again, Murdoch at Langdon had the highest yield, followed by Charger, Volda. Here's the 9590. A little bit about shadow. We did have some shadow last year, particularly where we had some uneven emergence. Some of varieties, came up almost 2 weeks later than the first one. So they're out there a longer amount of time. We had some wild weather the end of August previous year, a lot of wind. So we did get some shattering at Langdon and Nelson County. And this year we also had a little bit at Nelson County as well. So I just take kind of a rough 0 to 9 rating. It's impossible to count all the seeds on the ground within a square foot or something. So I just gave them a visual rating. So really 1s and 0 to 1 obviously are the best. 2's a little bit on the ground. The ones we typically saw a little bit more shattering over the 3 sites were Froberg, Commander, and Murdoch had a little bit more. One site this year at Nelson County, Rossi had a little bit of shattering along with the Dual and Ascent. And then the 2 sites, which have been Nelson and Langdon in 21, Buster and Barracuda. So some of these next slides, a lot of numbers and graphs. So I'm just going to look at the highs and the lows here. Highest test weight varieties. Test weights all this year were really good, between like 59.5 and 60.5 for the most part. So the higher ones were the Froberg, Huron, Trigger, Heartland, Igmar, and Wildcat. All these were pretty close to the average or close to 60 or above. And then we had, when we got slightly lower, the ones that were above 50 or below 59, a little bit were Cobra, Ambush, 3188, and then 2 onless varieties from Cropland. Days ahead, again, looking just at the earliest and the latest. The earliest lines that we have out there right now, probably a Barracuda and Cannon, Glen, Huron, and Allegiant line and Ascent. And our later ones are Recoil, Trigger, and the 2 onless lines. So that really stuck out this year. When we had the late planting date, it took a while for some of these varieties to mature on this end of it. So, keep in mind that some of these from the earliest to the latest are 10 days. I was at the Prairie Grain Conference, and Joachim Orstmann was talking about the line Torgy. There's a lot of different backgrounds in some of these lines, and that probably had a little bit of winter wheat background in it. So there were some comments, at least from that part of the region, that with the Torgy, you planted it late, it took forever to mature. And we didn't see so much in our variety trials here. We did have a couple trials we did plant in June as well, but didn't note that. But something that they were talking about at the Prairie Grain was with that particular variety. Plant height, the shorter ones would be the 9590, Barracuda, and Cannon, Heartland, some of the Allegiant lines, Gunsmoke. The taller lines would be Canadian line Rush, Ascend from South Dakota. That's one that had very good yields across each part of the state. And then a number at 35. So some of these that are taller varieties also have pretty good straw strength. So that's not always an indication, but again, you'll be dealing with more straw. Straw strength, Smith was one, this is on a regional basis, had the best straw strength. Ross is good straw strength, Washburn, 21st genetics, and 95-90. The weaker strawed ones would be Ranchero, Huron, Rebel, Faller, Justify, and Gunsmoke. Last year I didn't even have this slide up because there were no protein premiums. I did put it on this year. There's some small ones this year. The quote, this was at Langdon, was $9 at the end of November, and a fifth up and down premium. So really our top lines as far as a gross return would be in Charger and Valda, Spitfire, Ambush, and 3530. And you can go down here, you can see Washburn is slightly above the average. And as we continue on here, again, the ones with our lowest return this year would have been Huron, which is really, again, as I mentioned, more adapted to the far west part of the state. We have Cobra, Dual, Heartland Cannon, and Youndless Line 3119. So that kind of just gives you a rough idea to see where the protein premiums, yield, and protein or yield levels, how they returned, at least in our trials. Move on a little bit to Durham. Not very much Durham in the region. We have, I think, 26,000 acres. So that's pretty small. And then in the Northeast, compared to wheat, I think was at 1.3 million. Durham varieties don't change that often. Top one right now is one called ND Rivelin. And this is across the whole state, followed by Joppa, Divide, and El Cabo. For Durham varieties, there's not a lot of difference between some of the traits in Durham varieties. So you have stars by some of them. And I've mentioned this previously, those are varieties that have a low cadmium accumulating variety, which is important for if they're selling the Durham overseas. That's an important trait that they want to buy off of. The lodging on most of these are pretty similar. El Cabo probably has the best resistant to lodging. As far as days to heading, and height, scab levels are all quite similar to one another with some minor differences, as well as foliar diseases. Durham variety yields at from Langdon, Carrington, and Minot for 3 years. Top yielding ones would be Carpio. Diffie is another one that Crop Improvement got out of Canada to look at. We have Joppa, Mount Trail, Grano, and Stanley is the newest one. And here's the real one slightly below that line, and follows the same trend basically on the 3-year average with these varieties as well. At Langdon, we don't have a lot of changeover, so we got 5 years of data, and again, it follows kind of what we saw at the other research centers as well, with Reveland and Carpio, Stanley, Joppa, and Tioga in that Langdon. So any of those lines would perform about equal to the other variety, those other varieties in any particular year. Not a lot going on with barley at this point. Of course, 2 rows have taken over. That's what the maltsters want now. So that's basically what we're testing. We have one line in here called Tradition. Of course, the 6 row, and some of the 6 rows that are out there yet are used, a lot of it in the pet food market. You don't have to be so concerned with the protein or the scab levels, but the 6 rows that look the best at these locations, the Synergy and the Genesis. Brewski is a line that was released by NDSU, but it's marketed by solely one brewing company in the western part of the state. And ABI Cardinal has a fair amount of acreage probably as well. Test weight of all these lines this year were all above 48. Better ones were Explorer and Conlon, which not much of Conlon is grown, Cardinal and Synergy. And the plumps, it's a good year. Plumps were all above 90%. And for the tradition that had the highest protein, and all the 6 rows were basically between 10.5 and 11.5, and Genesis typically always has the lowest protein levels. You know, some of the frustrations with barley is it kind of has that stay green quality, so a lot of farmers want to swath it or don't want to swath it, so you harvest it, but it takes a long time to dry down, and then even when it is ripe, a lot of the straw on the bottom is green, so you have to go so much slower. And adding a fungicide to that also keeps it greener longer, so that some of the frustrations with the 2-row at this time. And I guess that's all we got. There's a couple sites you can look at besides the paper copies, NDSU variety trials. If you Google that, really have an old site up there yet, you can get the data off of that. Or we have a variety selection tool where you can put some, you want the highest yields or looking at test weight, and it'll throw some graphs up at you. And both of these sites also, you can download a PDF of the trials. And these are the main trials that the research centers are on, and also off-station sites as well. So that's about all I have for today. I hope we have a good year again this year. And I guess that's about it. I'll be around all day, so if you want to ask me any specific questions or we got information